So, which is it?
Half full.
Glass. That's what
Almost all of us have heard the question, is the glass half full or half empty? Of course, it's not a question with a correct answer. Both are accurate, but how one answers can say a lot about the way one looks at the world. The optimist, of course, says, the glass is half full. The pessimist says the glass is half empty. The engineer says the glass is twice as big as it needs to be. And of course, the scientist says that the glass is actually completely full of water and of air. But the other scientist points out that atoms are 99.9% empty space, so the glass is actually almost completely empty. And the third scientist says, well, a guess based on a visual cue is inaccurate, so mark the glass at the water level, pour the water into another glass, and then add the original water back in, and if the combined water overflows, the glass was more than half full, and if it doesn't, the glass was more than half empty. And the likelihood that there were the right number of water molecules to be exactly half empty or half full is practically impossible. I've got a few more of these. The politician says that under the last government, the glass was half empty and becoming emptier. But thanks to their own party's new leadership, the glass is definitely now half full and becoming fuller. But if the other party were to return to power, the glass would once again undoubtedly empty rapidly. And the exhausted parent whose kindergartner is off for spring break says, "Sweetheart, it's whatever you want it to be. Just let me please have 5 minutes of peace and quiet." And the IT support person will say that you should try emptying the glass and then refilling it. And the surrealist sees a giraffe wearing a necktie. The cynic wonders who drank the other half. And my personal favorite comes from the podcast Welcome to Nightingale. I think it requires a little bit of explanation. So this podcast is presented as a radio show about a fictional town where lots of paranormal things are always happening. And every conspiracy theory is actually true there. It's just a very weird place. And so he says, the optimist says the glass is half full, the pessimist says the glass is half empty. But it is only the truth seeker who wonders, why is the glass there? Why is there water all over the floor? Why is it covering every other surface in the house? Who or what is doing this to us? Jokes aside, I think that one answer is that it depends on context. One way to look at it is that if you have an empty glass that gets filled halfway, then it's half full. And if you have a full glass and half of it gets drunk or poured out, well, then it's half empty. So, say you've gone for a hike in the desert and the sun is beating down and the temperature is close to, well, here 90 degrees is nothing for you all, but say it's close to 110 degrees and it turns out your hike is longer than you thought and your water is almost gone because frankly you were underprepared, and then as you pass by a rocky outcropping you notice a bottle of water that someone had accidentally left behind and discover that bottle is half full, and that half full bottle, and it is definitely half full, is going to seem like a godsend. But say you're on that brutally hot desert hike and you've been trying to conserve your water by drinking it judiciously, but you're sweating profusely and your mouth is getting parched, so you decide to stop for a drink, but when you pull your water bottle out, you realize that the lid wasn't screwed on all the way and half of your water has spilled out. In that case, that bottle is definitely, crushingly half empty. But actually, most of the time it really just depends on our optimistic or pessimistic outlook. Because even the optimist could say, well, even though half the bottle spilled, at least I have half a bottle of water left. And even the pessimist might say, ugh, this water is too warm and it tastes plasticky. Now you can probably guess how Chani Gorkin, the author of that poem about the worst day ever, would answer the question. At the time she wrote it, Gorkin, a Hasidic Jew, was a high school student who got an assignment to describe her worst day ever. But Gorkin said she didn't think there was such a thing as the worst day ever, so she wrote a poem that reflects the Jewish idea that it's possible to control how we see the world, whether negatively or positively. She says, I wanted to show how your day is really based on how you look at things. One of the major tenets of Hasidic philosophy is that moach shalit al halev, that the mind rules over the heart, that we are able to channel our emotions to the positive, that there is God in everything, and it is part of our mission in life to look for the good, and to find it, and to spread it. Because the world needs more positivity, and optimism, and gratitude, which truly is so valuable for our own mental health and just our sense of satisfaction with our own lives. So, how can we move towards a perspective of seeing the glass half full? Well, I think one of the ways actually lies in one of the joke answers. The one about the engineer who says the glass is twice as large as it needs to be. Now, obviously, it's literally true, but on a metaphoric level, it may be the case that our expectations are unrealistic, and if we just pour the water into a smaller glass, and glass half full, glass half empty, I forgot to bring the big glass from home, and so now I'm stuck with a glass that wasn't quite as big, but you know what? I still have two glasses, and it still works, so glass half full. So if we just pour that water into a smaller glass, because it's 1.5 full. If we pour that water into a smaller glass, we would realize that things in our life may be closer to full than we had originally imagined. In a restaurant, if you serve a meal on a large plate with a lot of empty space, it gives the impression that the meal is smaller than if that same dish were served on a smaller plate. Yet, I think there's a danger too if we choose a glass too small. The danger is that we sell ourselves short. It lowers our expectations for our own lives. It lowers our expectations for what's possible, leading us to settle rather than stretching for bigger visions. Whether it's a career or a relationship or developing a skill like playing an instrument or cooking, or whether it's our own personal growth. If the glass is close to half full, we just might not be inspired to stretch, to reach. So where do we find the balance between striving and satisfaction? As we explored in last week's sermon, there is no easy answer. You have to find that balance for yourself. And I think it's important that we might want to reassess here the importance of emptiness. The Tao Te Ching, and the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu teaches that the emptiness of a cup is what makes it useful. The part of the glass that is already filled with water cannot accept another drop. As David Suzuki, the beloved Canadian broadcaster and scientist, articulates, emptiness, which is liable to be mistaken for sheer nothingness, is in fact the reservoir of infinite possibilities. It's in the emptiness that life happens. If our cup is already full, there's no room for anything new. There's no room for grace, for love, for God, for growth. And I think the danger of settling is particularly apparent when it comes to issues of justice, because there is always a more just and equitable world to be worked for. Where would we be now if all of the suffragettes had said, well, women got the right to vote, I guess we're done here? What if we had stopped with Title X? Well, there's still a pay gap, and women are subject to sexual harassment and assault, and all too frequently. Where would we be now if the abolitionists all stopped after slavery was abolished, or the civil rights movement had stopped after Brown versus Board of Education, but the rest of Jim Crow was still in place? What about the fight, the ongoing fight for black and brown lives in our economic system and our criminal justice system? What if the LGBTQ movement had stopped after the anti-sodomy laws were repealed, before marriage equality? What if we stopped now in the middle of the struggle for trans rights? What if we stopped while it's still legal in numerous states to fire someone and discriminate in many other ways, simply because of their sexual orientation and gender identity? What if we were to say that banning bump stocks and putting more armed police officers and metal detectors in our schools is sufficient to stem the tide of gun violence? What if we were to say, well, natural gas burns better than coal or oil, and, well, nuclear energy is carbon neutral, so what do we really need renewable, clean energy for? So sometimes, clearly, there's an argument for that half-empty glass. And to me, it's helpful to realize that there are actually two different types of optimism and pessimism. One is about seeing the positivity or negativity of what's already in our lives. In that case, a glass half full outlook, or a smaller glass more easily filled up with gratitude. That's the good one. But the other is about the way we think about the future, whether we have a positive outlook about the future or a negative one. And I want to talk about that second one for just a little bit. Now, most of us, about 80% roughly, actually tend towards an optimistic outlook. In fact, they've actually found that the associated genes within our DNA that predispose us towards one or the other. And so that 80%, they tend to overestimate, and most of us are obviously in that, tend to overestimate the likelihood of positive events occurring in the future, while greatly underestimating the likelihood of negative ones. And so that has some intriguing results, which came out of a decade-long study comparing optimists and pessimists. Now, optimists are less likely to be rehospitalized after a coronary bypass surgery. And they also tend to do better academically and socioeconomically. But the overall benefits of optimism are actually a little less clear-cut here, interestingly. You see, optimists overestimate their abilities and underestimate their risks when it comes to the future. And as a result, pessimists tend to be more cautious about planning for the future. And they tend to take less risks, particularly with regards to finances and health. Because pessimists think their health is more likely to decline, they're less likely to drink or smoke and more likely to exercise, and thus they're generally stay healthier than the optimists who think they're going to stay healthier. Which seems to indicate, surprising, almost mind-bogglingly, that pessimists may actually live longer, which is, I don't know, and that seems rough. A longer, more pessimistic life or a shorter optimistic life. So, is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? In reality, I think the most important point is not whether the glass is half empty or half full. It's about making the most of whatever is in the glass. As the Taoist writer Derek Lin says, the sage does not worry about answering that question. Instead, she takes the glass and drinks from it, and relishes the thirst-quenching water. She puts the glass back down and remains quiet, perhaps with a smile on her face, as others scramble to revise their estimation from half full to a quarter full or half empty to 3/4 empty. The sage knows that the essence of life is to be lived, not debated. The glass and water serve one purpose, admirably well, and that is to slake thirst. Trying to decide if it is half full or half empty does absolutely nothing to further that purpose. Discussing the glass can never replace the experience of drinking from it. Describing the various perspectives will never get you closer to the actual act of savoring the water.